Wyoming Territory, September 1882. The wind cut low across the plains as the westbound train hissed to a stop in the tiny town of Larkspur, kicking up dust and carrying with it one woman whose life had just been packed into a battered carpetbag. Delilah Zeller stepped off the train with her boots stiff from hours of stillness and her heart knotted tight in her chest. The letter in her pocket was worn soft from too much reading. A promise from a man named Emmett who'd written in tidy script that he was looking for a good woman to raise his 2 motherless children. He had described a white farmhouse on 30 acres, 2 kind children, Ruthie and Ray, and the hope for a second chance. Delilah had answered that letter with her whole heart. She had nothing keeping her in Pennsylvania. Her father had passed last spring, her mother years before that, and the seamstress shop she worked at had shuttered without warning. She had no dowry, no kin left, just a quiet kind of hope that maybe, finally, she could belong somewhere. She stepped onto the cracked platform, brushing dust from her skirts, and scanned the waiting crowd. Her eyes found a man in a brown vest holding a little boy by the hand. The girl standing beside him had a braid down her back and a hard look in her eyes that did not match her age. "Are you Emmett?" Delilah asked, her voice catching. The man looked her over, his mouth pressed into a line. "You are younger than I expected." She swallowed. "I wrote you the truth. 24 last May." He shifted on his boots. "I thought you would be plainer." His eyes darted to the children. Ruthie looked away. The boy clung tighter to his leg. "I can cook and sew and I changed my mind," he said flatly. "I do not want a stranger raising my children." The words hit like a slap. The air seemed to thicken. She nodded, barely, though her legs felt hollow. She turned away, blinking back tears, not wanting to cry in front of the children. She walked down the platform and sat on a wooden bench with her bag clutched to her chest. The train hissed behind her, and the sun was too hot for September. She could not go back. There was no back to go to. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later, staring at the dust curling over her boots, when a voice spoke from beside her. "Did you come for me?" Delilah looked up. A man stood there, tall and broad in the shoulders, wearing a trail-worn shirt and a hat that had seen better days. His eyes were the color of dark honey, and they held a soft curiosity, not pity. "I what?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "You look like a woman who expected someone to meet her, and I reckon I look like a man who was hoping someone just like you would get off that train." His voice was quiet, but sure. He had a saddlebag slung over one shoulder and a rifle strapped across his back. He looked like he belonged to the land, like he had seen hard things and come out the other side steady. Delilah blinked. "No, I came for someone else." He changed his mind. The man nodded, like that made a sad sort of sense. "Name's Abram Kessler." "Delilah Zeller." He tipped his hat. "Well, Delilah Zeller, if no one claimed you, maybe you were meant for someone else." She gave a bitter laugh. "I do not think I was meant for anyone. You do not strike me as the kind of woman who gives up that easy." She looked at him then, really looked. He had a quiet calm about him, like he did not need to fill silence just to fill it. There was something steady and kind in his eyes. "Why would you say that?" she asked. "Because you came all this way on your own. That tells me you've got grit. And because I saw the way you held yourself when he turned you away. You did not cry. You did not yell. You just stood tall and walked off. That says something." She stared at him, unsure what to say. "You have a place to stay?" he asked. She shook her head. "Well," he said slowly, "I have a spare room in my cabin. I live out near the foothills. It is quiet, but safe. I will not touch you or expect anything. But you can stay until you figure out what comes next." She hesitated. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged. "My mama raised me to be good to people when they are down. And maybe I was hoping someone like you would show up one day. She studied his face. There was no deceit there, just a quiet kind of warmth. All right, she said finally. Just for a few days. His eyes softened. That is enough for now. They left together, walking to where his horse was tied. He helped her up gently, like she was something fragile but not broken. She held onto the saddle horn, and he swung up behind her. The ride was long, the land wide and open. They passed groves of aspen and slow-moving creeks. The sky stretched out forever. When they reached his cabin near dusk, she was surprised by how tidy it was. A small porch, smoke curling from the chimney. A dog barked once and wagged its tail. He showed her the guest room, a bed with a quilt, a table, a wash basin. There's stew on the stove, he said. You are welcome to it. She nodded, unsure how to thank him. That night, after the stew and a long silence by the fire, she looked up and said, I do not know what I would have done if you had not come. He looked at her, the firelight soft on his face. Maybe you did come for me after all. She smiled, and for the first time in days, it reached her eyes. Delilah woke to the sound of wood splitting. The air inside the cabin had cooled with the night, and the scent of pine smoke lingered faintly beneath the door. She sat up slowly, easing her feet to the floor. Her boots were cold where they sat by the wall, and the quilt had tangled around her legs during sleep. She folded it neatly before washing her face at the basin, hands stiff from unfamiliar work. Outside, Abram was splitting logs with measured rhythm. His sleeves were rolled, revealing lean muscle and a long scar that trailed down the inside of his forearm. He noticed her at the door and paused, resting the axe head in the stump. You sleep all right? He asked. Well enough, she said, brushing her hair back. There's coffee on the stove. You're welcome to it. She stepped out into the morning. The sky was pale and cloudless, and frost still clung to the grass in shaded spots. A hawk circled far above, gliding without hurry. I've never been this far west, she said, watching the horizon. He nodded and returned to the woodpile. It's quieter here than most folks expect. Nearest neighbors a half-day's ride. She wrapped her shawl tighter. And you like it that way? I do. He split another log clean through. But I don't mind company that knows how to listen. Delilah walked toward the fence where a few chickens pecked at the ground. A red one eyed her warily. There's a coop behind the shed, Abram said without looking up. They'll go in on their own come dusk. She turned. You keep them for eggs? And for the noise. Makes the place feel lived in. She picked up a basket from the nail by the door and began collecting what the hens had left. Her fingers were still clumsy with the work, but she didn't drop any. By mid-morning, she had swept the cabin and washed the dishes from last night. Abram returned with a bucket of water balanced on one shoulder and set it by the door. I was thinking, he said, I could show you the ridge trail. There's a view up there worth seeing. She hesitated, drying her hands on her apron. I don't want to take up your time. He met her eyes. It's not a chore. The trail wound through low brush and stands of aspen that hadn't yet turned. They didn't speak much as they walked, the silence companionable. At the top, the land spread out below them in soft gold and pale green, a ribbon of river cutting through the far end. The wind carried the scent of juniper and something older earth warmed by sun. Delilah sat on a flat rock, her skirts fanned around her. Abram crouched beside her with his arms resting on his knees. I used to ride up here after my brother passed. Helps me think straight. She glanced at him. What happened? Stampede. He was working a cattle drive south of Rollins. Horse spooked. He went under. She let the words settle before speaking. I'm sorry. He nodded once. His name was Eli. She looked out at the sweep of land. My father died last spring. He worked in a foundry. Caught lung rot. By the end, he couldn't climb stairs without coughing blood. Abram didn't offer comfort, just sat beside her quietly, hands folded. I hated leaving him behind, she said. But I couldn't stay in that house. It was full of ghosts. The kind that don't need doors, he said. She turned to him, surprised. Yes, exactly. They sat like that for a while, the wind shifting her hair loose from its pins. Abram didn't rush her, didn't fill the space with talk. When they stood to leave, he offered his hand to help her up. She took it, warm and rough, and the pressure of his fingers steadied her more than she expected. That evening, she helped prepare supper. He chopped onions while she stirred beans into the pot. The dog lay curled beneath the table, tail thumping softly. You always cook for yourself? She asked. Most days, though I've burned enough biscuits to know my limits. She laughed, then caught herself, surprised at the sound. He gave her a look, not amusement so much as quiet approval, like he'd been waiting to hear it. After they ate, he brought out a deck of cards. You play. Not well, she said, sitting across from him. Good. I don't either. They played until the fire burned low, and shadows stretched long behind the chairs. She didn't win, but he never gloated. Just leaned back and said, You catch on quick. She gathered the cards, stacking them neatly. I never thought I'd end up here. Neither did I, he said. She looked at him, the lamplight softening the lines at the corners of his eyes. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now, she said. You don't have to know yet. He stood and poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup. One day at a time, he said, offering it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a weight pressing down but something waiting, steady and quiet, just ahead. The first frost came sudden, crisping the edges of the sage and leaving the porch boards slick with morning ice. Delilah pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped outside, breath showing faint in the air. Behind her, the door creaked as Abram followed, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. You ever ride before? He asked, adjusting the brim of his hat against the rising sun. Once. Long ago. It wasn't graceful. He gave a small nod. No one's born knowing how. You'll learn. She followed him to the corral, where a dapple gray mare stood shifting her weight, ears flicking with interest. Abram opened the gate and stepped inside, quiet and deliberate. Delilah watched how he moved unhurried, hands easy but certain. He rubbed the mare's neck, murmuring something low before looping the rope around her halter. She's called Junebug, he said. Gentle as they come, but she won't be led by someone unsure of themselves. He handed Delilah the lead. The rope felt rough and alive in her grip. The mare's eyes met hers, unreadable but calm. She'll follow if you believe she will, Abram said. Delilah took a breath and stepped forward. The mare hesitated, then matched her pace. Together they circled the pen once, then twice. When they stopped, Abram gave a single nod, not of praise, but recognition. Later, he saddled his own horse and led both mounts to the trail behind the house. There's a creek I want you to see, he said. Good place for thinking. They rode in single file, the trail narrow beneath cottonwoods gone yellow with the season. Delilah's hands ached from gripping the reins, but she didn't complain. The mare walked steady beneath her, and the air smelled of damp leaves. At the water's edge, they dismounted. Abram knelt to check a snare, pulling out an empty loop. Nothing today, he said, standing. Delilah crouched to rinse her hands in the cold stream. The water numbed her fingers, but the shock of it cleared her mind. You trap often? When I need to. Sometimes for pelts, sometimes for food. Depends on the winter ahead. She looked up at him, And what do you do when the snow comes in too deep to ride out? He sat on a flat rock, arms resting on his knees. Keep the fire strong. Read what I've got. Wait it out. Delilah sat beside him. I used to read by lamplight when I couldn't sleep, mostly old sermons and penny novels. My father said it kept the devil off my shoulder. Did it? No, she said, a faint smile on her lips. But it passed the time. The creek ran low, murmuring over stone. Abram picked up a pine cone, turned it in his hands, then set it down again. You plan on staying long? He asked, without looking at her. I hadn't planned anything past that train platform. He nodded once. I've got room, and no one else to share it with. Delilah traced a finger along the hem of her sleeve. You ever been married? No. Came close. She chose someone with steadier prospects. A storekeeper in Sheridan. She waited. He didn't say more. And you? He asked. There was a man when I was 17, she said. He asked my father for permission, but after my mother died, everything shifted. There wasn't time for courting. Abram stood and offered her a hand. She took it, rising carefully. As they rode back, clouds rolled in low. The wind had changed cooler, heavier. He glanced at the sky. Storms coming. Back at the cabin, they worked in tandem, he stacking wood beneath the porch, she boiling potatoes and chopping the last of the carrots from the root cellar. The dog paced the floor, uneasy with the shift in air. By nightfall, rain drummed hard against the roof. They sat close to the hearth, the warmth of the fire pressing back against the cold. Abram held a worn book open in his hands. You want to hear something? She nodded. He read aloud, voice slow and steady. The story was plain, an account of a man building a cabin with his brother, but the words carried a weight that filled the room. Delilah listened, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the flames. When he finished, he closed the book gently. You read like you lived it, she said. I remember what matters. She turned toward him. What do you remember most? He looked at her, not away. The sound of someone breathing beside you, when nothing else moves. Her breath caught, not startled, but seen. Outside, the storm rolled on. Inside, they didn't speak again, but they sat until the fire burned low, and the space between them held something quiet and new, unhurried, certain and growing. By late October, the mornings came colder, the days shorter, and the trees along the ridge trail stood bare-limbed and silvered with rime. Delilah had taken to rising before first light, slipping into her boots while the cabin still held the hush of sleep, and stirring the stove to life with practiced, quiet hands. She moved with a rhythm now her own, not borrowed from anyone else's schedule. Abram came in just after sunrise from tending the snare lines east of the ridge. His coat was damp from a low fog that hadn't yet lifted, his gloves stiff with frost. Something's been dragging off the bait, he said, setting a small, empty trap on the table. Tracks look like a fox. Might be teaching its kits. Delilah ladled porridge into 2 bowls without asking. How far out? Near the draw, past the old cottonwood. I'll reset it before dusk. She handed him a spoon. Leave a little meat in the croft bin when you go. If it's feeding young, it'll keep coming back. He looked at her then, not surprised, just thoughtful. You know trapping? No, she said, sitting across from him. But I watched a woman once who did. She could read the ground like a book. He ate quietly, the only sound the steady tick of the wall clock and the wind bumping against the shutters. When the bowls were scraped clean, he set his spoon down and leaned back slightly. Sarah Downing passed through town last week. I ran into her at the livery, he said. She asked if I was still living alone. Delilah folded the cloth napkin in her lap. And what did you tell her? I said I wasn't. He didn't look away as he said it, and she didn't ask him to explain. Her hands stayed still on the table. After breakfast, she walked out to the shed to check the root baskets. The last of the turnips had gone soft, and the onions were sprouting. She sorted what she could salvage, her breath puffing in the cold air, and carried the bad ones to the edge of the field for the mule deer that sometimes came down at dusk. When she turned to head back, she saw Abram standing by the fence, oiling the latch on the gate. He straightened as she approached. "You ever been to a harvest dance?" he asked. "No," she said. "I've seen one from a window. Never went in." He rubbed a thumb along the edge of the tin can in his hand. "There's one in town come Saturday, at the Grange Hall. Music, pie, probably some off-key singing. I don't have anything proper to wear," she said, brushing a curl from her cheek. "There's a dressmaker in town. Owes me a favor." Delilah hesitated, then gave a small nod. "All right." That afternoon, they rode into Larkspur together. Abram didn't speak much on the trail, but his horse stayed close beside hers. The town was busier than she remembered. Young men unloading sacks of feed, a boy chasing a runaway hat down the main street, the blacksmith's hammer ringing clear. The dressmaker's shop stood just past the mercantile, its windows fogged over from the heat inside. The woman who greeted them was short and fast-talking, with spectacles that kept slipping down her nose. "I can let out a hem on the blue calico," she said, already rummaging through a rack. "It'll suit her fine, and there's enough room in the sleeves for a shawl." Delilah stood still while the woman pinned the bodice tighter. Abram sat in a chair by the stove, arms crossed, watching quietly. "She's got a good figure," the dressmaker said, not unkindly. "Be ashamed to waste it on these prairie cuts." Delilah flushed and glanced at Abram. He didn't smile, but there was a softness at the corner of his eyes. They left with the dress wrapped in brown paper. On the ride home, the wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the trail. Delilah adjusted her scarf and looked sideways at him. "You don't seem like a dancing man." "I'm not," he said, "but I figured you might be." She shook her head. "I don't know how." "I'll show you." She raised a brow. "You just said you don't dance." "I said I'm not a dancing man. Didn't say I never learned." Back at the cabin, she unwrapped the dress and hung it by the stove to air. It was simple, deep blue with a row of tiny buttons down the front, the kind of garment made for moving rather than showing off. She ran her hand along the fabric, then turned to find Abram laying wood in the hearth, his back to her. "I'm not used to being looked after," she said. He stood, brushing ash from his palms. "Neither am I." The space between them held more than the fire's warmth now. It held the weight of what they hadn't said, and the quiet shape of something not yet spoken, but already understood. Delilah crossed to the window and watched the light fade behind the hills. The wind had stilled, and the dog lay curled beneath the table, content. "I'll need a pin for my hair," she said, not turning. "I'll find one." She smiled, faint and true. "Thank you, Abram." He nodded once. They didn't speak again that night, but when he passed her the quilt before bed, his hand brushed hers, and neither of them moved away. The Grange Hall stood lit like a lantern against the prairie dark, yellow lamplight pouring from the windows and spilling over the packed earth outside. A fiddle sang high and quick through the open doors, joined by a stomping rhythm that shook the boards of the porch. Horses stood tied in a neat row out front, their breath puffing white into the chill. Inside, Delilah stood just past the threshold, fingers curled tight around the edge of her shawl. The dress fit well enough, though the buttons tugged slightly when she breathed too deep. The room was crowded, warm, and close, a far cry from the hush of Abram's cabin or the quiet fields behind it. Abram was near the back, a mug of cider in one hand, eyes already on her. He hadn't touched her all day, not once, but now he crossed the floor without hesitation, weaving between neighbors and strangers alike, until he stood just in front of her. "You made it," he said. "I said I would," she answered, lifting her chin just slightly. He looked down at her hands. "Do you want to?" She hesitated. "Not sure I'll remember the steps." "Good thing I do." He offered her his hand, and she took it. The first few measures were a stumble, her feet unsure, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. But he led without pressure, just enough to steady her without dragging. The music swelled and dipped, and by the second turn she was moving with him in a rhythm that felt like something older than memory. "You've danced before," she said quietly as they turned again. "My mother taught me. Said a man ought to know how to carry a woman without stepping on her." She was right. They danced 2 songs, then 3, never speaking much between them. The space in the room shifted around them, laughter, clapping, the creak of boards, but they were their own still center. When they finally stepped aside, breathless and flushed, he took her hand again without fanfare and led her out to the porch. Above them, the sky stretched black and star-soaked. The wind had quieted, and the night smelled of hay and wood smoke. Abram leaned one shoulder against the railing. "I saw the way you watched the sky when we first rode out together. Like you were waiting for something." "I was," she said. "I just didn't know what." He looked at her, and not with the quiet reserve he'd worn so often, but with something open and clear. "I've watched over this land a long time, worked it, waited, but it never felt full. Not until you stepped off that train." Delilah's breath caught, not with surprise, but with knowing. "I didn't think I'd be wanted," she said, voice low. "You weren't just wanted," he said. "You were the piece I didn't know I was missing." She turned to face him fully, the porch boards cold beneath her shoes. "Are you saying you want me to stay?" "I'm saying I want you to be mine," he said. "Not just in the cabin. Not just through winter. For good." He didn't reach for her, not yet. He waited. Delilah stepped close, her hands settling at his chest. "I don't need a promise to feel it, but I'll take one if you mean it." "I do." She leaned up, pressed her lips to his, not tentative, not rushed, just sure. When they parted, his hands came to rest at her waist, steady as always. They rode back to the cabin in silence, their hands brushing now and then beneath the blanket they shared. When they arrived, she didn't go to the guest room. She followed him to his own, unhurried, and closed the door behind her. The first snow came 3 days later. They spent the morning mending a broken hinge on the barn door, working side by side without needing to speak. When the work was done and the wind picked up, they sat by the fire with their feet tucked close and their hands laced together. By the second snowfall, the cabin had changed. Her sewing basket sat near the hearth now, and his coat hung beside her shawl. They moved in tandem, him splitting wood, her tending stew, and both of them meeting in the middle when the day went still. In late November, they rode into town again. This time, it was Delilah who stepped into the general store, placed a firm hand on the counter, and ordered a bolt of muslin and a spool of white thread. The clerk smiled and asked, "Sewing something special?" She only nodded. "A dress," she said. "Something simple." That winter, they married in the front room of the cabin, with Ruthie and Ray standing beside them. Emmett's children had come with their uncle, who'd taken them in after his brother's death. The boy had outgrown his shoes, and the girl still didn't smile much. Delilah knelt and offered them each a slice of honey cake and a place to sit beside the fire. They stayed 2 nights before heading back east, and when they rode out, Ruthie left behind a small carved bird on the mantel. The spring thaw came early. The creek ran high, and the aspen pushed out new leaves like hope. Delilah planted a row of squash beside the cabin, and Abram built her a bench beneath the cottonwood that shaded the west side. Some days, They sat there without speaking, the quiet between them full of everything they didn't need to say. When the rains came, they moved inside, reading by lamplight or playing cards while the dogs scratched lazy at the door. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Delilah set down her needlework and rested a hand on her belly. Abram looked up, eyes going still. She smiled. "I think it's time we built a cradle." He crossed to her slowly, knelt, and pressed a hand beside hers, reverent. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, soft and steady. And inside that cabin warmed by fire, filled with the scent of pine and bread and the sure, quiet love of two people who had once been strangers, there was nothing missing, and nothing left to wait for.